Okay, we've talked about the doctrine of total depravity, which means that man is completely unable to cope with his sinful state in a manner to gain or contribute to his salvation. We've talked about the doctrine of unconditional election, which means that God has elected a people whom he chose upon his own will and purpose, not conditioned upon the goodness of man. So now we're going to move to the doctrine of limited atonement. T, total depravity. U, unconditional election. L, limited atonement. There are some other words that are associated with this same doctrine of limited atonement, which is sometimes referred to as definite atonement or particular redemption. So all three of these are intended to convey that the work of Christ was with design and purpose, and that it actually accomplished salvation for the elect. We talk about unconditional election, so there's a people that have been elected, chosen by God unto salvation. So then, when we talk about limited atonement, one of the problems that most of us have when we get to this doctrine is the world has taught us that Jesus died to make salvation possible for everybody. But I believe that the Bible teaches something differently. I believe the Bible actually teaches that when Jesus died on the cross, shed his blood, he died for a particular people. So it is referred to as limited atonement. Now, that doesn't mean that his power, the power of his blood is limited. Jesus is infinite. God is infinite. There are no dimensions. It accomplishes, there is no measurement, no way that we can really determine how far it stretches. However, while the power is infinite, the scope is limited. The power is infinite, the scope is limited. For instance, a poison arrow will kill any animal or any individual that it hits, more than likely. So there is no limit in the ability of the poison arrow to kill, but there's a scope. And the scope is, it is only going to kill the one that it hits. So that there is no limit to the power of the blood of Christ, but there's a limit to the scope of the blood of Christ. So the question comes, did Christ die to make it possible for God to save sinners, or did he die to purchase the salvation for sinners? And I believe the Bible teaches that he died to purchase salvation for sinners. If we believe that he died to make salvation possible for all individuals, we limit the power of his atonement. The power of his atonement is not limited. The power is not limited in that he accomplished what he intended to accomplish. If we believe that he died to purchase salvation for some people, then we limit the extent of his atonement. So I believe when we talk about limited atonement, we're talking about limited in its extent. The extent of the atonement is limited, which means that Jesus actually died on the cross for and shed his blood, if you would, for a particular people. He did more than make salvation possible. He actually purchased the salvation of his people. Christ did not come simply to enable man to save themselves. Matthew 1:21, Luke 19:10, 1 Corinthians 5:21, Galatians 1:3-4, 1 Timothy 1:15. Christ secured reconciliation for his people. He secured reconciliation. He brought us back in line with God. He brought a particular people back in line with God by his death, burial, and resurrection. So then, when we look at Scripture in Romans 5 and 10, 2 Corinthians 5, 18 and 19, and Colossians 1, 20 through 22, we find that Christ secured salvation for his people. Christ actually secured righteousness and pardon for the justification of his people. Romans 3, 24 and 25, Romans 5, 8 and 9, 1 Corinthians 1 and 30. So Christ came, he suffered, and he died to fulfill the terms of the arrangement that he entered into with his Father before the foundation of the world. Christ came to save all of the people that the Father had given him. Read John 6, verses 35 through 40. Christ gave his life for the sheep. He didn't give his life for goat. Goat will never become sheep. He gave his life for his sheep. John 10 and 11. Then John 10, 14 through 18. John 10, 24 through 29. So then Christ prayed only for those who were given to him by the Father. John 17, 1 through 11. So I think it becomes clear once we study Scripture in its context that Christ purchased the inherited spiritual blessing for all of those who were given to him by the Father. Ephesians 1, verses 3 to 12. Now, we find the usage of certain terms in Scripture. For instance, the usage of terms like all men, or phrases, and world in Scripture. Some texts speak of the work of Christ in general terms. Phrases such as the world, all men, all nation, every creature were used to correct the mistaken idea that Christ came only to save the Jews. So you find words throughout Scripture. All men mean that not just Jews, but Jews and Gentiles. All world, not just Jerusalem, but all of the world. There are people and nations all over this world whom Christ will save. People of nations, I should say. So then the use of the word all is intended to reveal that Christ died for all men without distinction. Romans 5, 18, 2 Corinthians 5, 14 and 15, 1 Timothy 2, 4 through 6, and Hebrews 2 and 9. Other texts speak of the work of Christ in definite terms. They reveal his intention to infallibly save a particular people. Bunch of scriptures. Matthew 1:21, Matthew 20 verse 28, Matthew 26:28, John 10:11, and a bunch of scriptures. So, to conclude this, let me ask this question, or let me put it this way. If Christ died for all of the sins of all individuals would be saved. If he died for all of the sins of all individuals would be saved. But if he died for some of the sins of some individuals, nobody would be saved. If he only died for some of the sins, there are some sins that are still out there that have not been atoned for. But if Christ died for all of the sins of some of the people, then the people for whom he died are only the ones who will be saved. Limited atonement. Christ died for a particular people.